In a recent video, I showcased a compact navigation pane using the new toolbar control in Power Apps. During that video, I also showed a preview of the Fluent UI React Nav control. Many people were interested in seeing this modern navigation component recreated in Power Apps, so in this video we'll be taking a look at creating our own version of this. The preview nav control provides a simple list of navigation items using the Fluent UI design. Each of the buttons in the nav control have an icon and an indicator showing the currently selected nav item. In the component, there are also various drop-down buttons, which expand to show another level of buttons. We can see that there are also different categories within the control where you can group and separate various buttons. Towards the bottom of the control, we can also see that the component allows for dividers to be inserted to further separate the buttons. This is all functionality that we will create in our Power App. The basic design of this component will have a gallery to display each item from a collection that contains all of our buttons, our categories, our dividers, and our sub-buttons. What is shown in each gallery item will depend on a field in our collection where we will specify the type of the item, whether it's a button, a category, a divider, or a dropdown. Let's first start by building this collection. We'll navigate to the app properties and select the onStart property. In onStart, we'll insert a clear-collect function, and we'll name this collection Fluent Nav Items. We'll go ahead and insert a record using the curly brackets. There are some key properties that we'll need to introduce to our component in this collection. First, every item in our navigation needs a unique item key. This is how we'll know which button is currently pressed, which one is currently selected, and any other operations we'd need to do involving the items of our navigation component. Next is the item display name. This will be the text that shows up on clickable buttons, drop-down items, or the text for a category header. The item icon name is the Fluent UI icon that will appear for all buttons and drop-downs in the component. The item screen property is what will allow us to designate which screen should be associated with each clickable button in the control. Item type will tell our component whether the individual gallery item is a button, a category, a divider, or a dropdown. Item open will be used for drop-down menus to determine if the menu is open or closed. And finally, we have the item parent key. This is what we will use to designate that an item should be a sub-button to another item. The item's parent key would be the item key of another button in the list that we want to appear as a drop-down item. We have a couple of screens here in our app, so I'll just fill in an item for each screen. We'll also add some categories and dividers into the collection as well. With our collection set up, let's just recap what it's doing here. We have multiple items in this collection showing the different screens that we have in our Power App. The first item shows our home screen, followed by a divider, which will be a straight line to separate the next items that come after it. That's followed by a screen for our projects, as well as a screen for our trainings. Below this is a category header for employee management. And then under this will be a drop-down menu for our employee actions. This does not have a screen associated with it, since there will be some buttons as sub-items to this drop-down menu. Below that, we have the Find Employee and the Add Employee screens, which have a property for the item parent key, which is pointed to our employee actions item. This is what will make these buttons appear under our employee actions drop-down menu. This is followed by another divider, and then a button for our settings page. With our screen set up, we'll go ahead and right-click on our app property, and we'll select Run on Start. This will run our clear-collect function and create our collection. Let's now head over to our components, and we'll create a new component. We'll name this component Fluent UI Nav. For our component, we'll set the width to 260 and the height to 800 for now. We also want to enable the Access App Scope setting for our component. The Fluent 2 control we looked at as an example has a background fill, so we'll go ahead and set the fill of our component to 240. Inside of the component, we'll add a vertical container named Container Component. We'll also set this container's x and y values to 0, and the width to parent.width, and the height to parent.height. While we're here, we'll also go ahead and set the drop shadow to none, and the border radius to 0. Next, we'll start to insert our controls. Inside our component container, we'll insert a blank flexible height gallery named Gal Navigation. The data source for this gallery will be our collection of navigation items. We'll set the container alignment for this to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll also enable flexible height and change the minimum height to 0. After this, we also want to set the template padding to 5 and head to the Advanced tab to set the loading spinner property to loadingspinner.none. Now with our gallery set up, we'll insert our controls into it. First, we'll insert a vertical container into the gallery named Container Main. We want the vertical justification to be set to center and the width to be set to parent.templateWidth. We'll change the height property in a moment, but for now we'll set it to 40 and also change the x and y properties to 0. Further down, we'll continue on to set the border radius to 0 and the drop shadow to none. Next, we'll insert a vertical container into our main container, and we'll name this Container Height. We'll set the container width to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll disable flexible height and set the height to 1. The drop shadow for this container will also be none. The purpose of this container is to sit at the bottom of our main container, and this will give us a way to tell what the height property of our main container should be. Since the container will always be at the bottom of the main container, its y property is what we want to set our main container's height property to. We'll select our main container and navigate to its height property. Then we'll set this to containerHeight.y. Now we need to insert our different possible items that can show up in our navigation menu. We'll have buttons to directly navigate to another screen, dividers, categories, and a drop-down button to reveal nested sub-buttons in the menu. Let's first start with creating the regular navigation buttons. We'll insert a horizontal container in our main container, and we'll move this container to the top of the main container. This container will be named Container Button. We'll set the vertical alignment of this container to center, and we'll also set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0. And the height to 40. We also want to set the drop shadow to none. Inside our button container, we'll insert a button named Button Navigation. For this button, we'll enable the flexible width option, and we'll set the minimum width to 0. We want the type of this button to be subtle, and we also want the text of the button to be left aligned. Importantly, we also need to set the left padding for this button to 6. There's a default padding of 12 for buttons if nothing is entered, and we don't want any empty space on the left side of the button. Next, we'll also add an indicator for which item is selected in our component. We'll go ahead and add a regular container to our button container, and we'll name this Container Selected. We'll move this to the left of our navigation button as well. The height of this container will be 24, and the width will be 4. The border radius should be 4 as well, with a drop shadow set to none. In the navigation button's onSelect property, we'll set a variable called varSelectedButton. The value of this variable will be thisItem.itemKey. Next, we'll add a navigate function, and we'll navigate to thisItem.itemScreen. This will store the selected button's item key in our variable, and then navigate to the screen that's associated with the button. We can use the variable to show or hide the selected button indicator. We'll go back to our selected container and we'll select the color property. To only show this when the button is selected, we'll insert the following formula. If this item.itemKey equals var selected button, then we want the color to be app.theme.colors.primary, which is the primary color of our selected theme. If not, we want the color of this to be transparent, so we'll keep the old transparent RGBA value. In this case, we don't want to change the control's visible property because the button would jump to the left and right depending on if the item was selected. Instead, we always want to keep the indicator visible, but only give it a color when the button is selected. We also want to change the font weight of our button based on whether the button is selected or not. To do this, we'll select our navigation button and we'll go to the font weight property. In here, we'll insert the following formula. If this item.itemKey equals var selected button, then we want the font weight to be semi-bold. If not, it should be normal. Now, when a button is selected, the indicator will show and the font weight will change to semi-bold. Otherwise, the indicator would be hidden and the font weight will be normal. We'll do a similar formula for the icon style property as well. If the button is selected, we want the icon to be filled, and if not, it should be an outline. Lastly, we need to set our button's values to the data from our gallery. We'll set the text property to this item.itemDisplayName, and we'll set the icon to this item.itemIconName. Now we just need to set the button container's visible property to only show when the item type designates that this is a button. We'll select the button container, and then we'll go to the visible property. Here, we'll insert the formula, this item.itemType equals button. Now that we've set up our button container, we can use this to create our other containers for categories, dividers, and submenus. We'll select our button container and copy it, and then paste it inside our main container again. We'll rename this to container category and reorder this container to be above our height container. Next, we'll need to make a couple changes to our container. First, we'll set the left padding of the container to 14, and then we'll set the height to 32. Inside the container, we'll delete the controls that are present. Instead of these controls, we'll simply insert a text control and name it label category. For this control, we'll set the wrap property to false, the vertical text alignment to middle, and we'll enable the flexible width option and set the minimum width to 0. We'll also set the font weight to semi-bold. The text property of this control is going to be very similar to our buttons, so it's going to be this item.itemDisplayName. Now we only want this category text label to appear when the item type is category. So we'll go back to our category container and we'll select the visible property. Instead of the item type equaling button, we'll set this to be visible when the item type is equal to category. Next, we'll work on our dividers. We'll copy our button container again and paste it in the main container. We'll rename this container to container divider, and then we'll move it up above our height container. For this container's properties, we'll set the gap to 0, the padding on all sides to 4, and the height of the control to 8. Inside the divider container, we'll go ahead and delete the controls that are present, and then we'll go ahead and insert a regular container. We'll call this container container divider line. For our divider line, we'll set the control to be center aligned, and then we'll set the height of the control to 1. We'll also enable flexible width and set the minimum width to 0. Now we can choose a color for our divider. You can go with any color you like, but I'll just select this light gray color. While we're here, we'll also set the drop shadow to none. For the visible property of our divider container, we want this container to be visible when the item type is equal to divider. So far we have our navigation buttons, our categories, and our dividers. The last thing we need is to add our layered buttons so that we can have nested buttons inside of our navigation. We'll again copy and paste our button container, and we'll rename this to container dropdown. We'll also go ahead and move this above our height container. Inside of our dropdown container, we'll rename the new copy of our navigation button to Button Dropdown. In the onSelect property, we'll change our formula so that it's patching our collection of navigation items. We want to patch this item and change the item open field to the opposite of its current value. With this formula in place, we'll copy and paste our button dropdown control into our dropdown container to create a copy of it, and we'll rename this to Button Dropdown Arrow. The only difference with this copy of the button is that we want to set the layout to icon only, the text alignment to center, and the width to 32. We'll also want to remove the left padding from the control. Now we want this button to show a right arrow if the dropdown is closed, and a down arrow if the item is open. So we'll insert the following formula into the icon property. If this item.itemOpen, then the icon should be chevron down. And if not, it should be chevron right. When the itemOpen property of this item equals true, it'll show a down arrow. And when it's false, or closed in other words, it'll show a right arrow. Now that we have the button that will expand a drop-down menu when selected, we need to create the actual drop-down. We'll insert a vertical container into our main container, and we'll name this container subbuttons. We'll go ahead and move this above our height container as well. For the container's properties, we'll need to set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and the height is going to be dynamic later, but for now we'll set this to 60. We'll also set the border radius to 0 and the drop shadow to none. Inside this container, we'll add a blank vertical gallery named gal subbuttons. The width of this gallery should be set to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and the flexible height option should be enabled with a minimum height of 0. We'll set the template size to 40 and the template padding to 0. And we'll disable the scroll bar. We'll also need to head to the advanced properties and set the loading spinner to none. For our sub-button gallery, we'll need the items to only show those buttons that have a parent item key for the appropriate dropdown. We'll use the following formula in the items property of the gallery. We want to filter our collection by the item parent key equaling this item.item key. Now the gallery will only show the appropriate sub-buttons related to the parent drop-down button. Next, we'll copy our button container from the original gallery, and we'll paste it inside of our new sub-buttons gallery. We'll want to make sure that this new button container has its width and height set to parent.template width and parent.template height. For our buttons inside this new container, we'll need to make sure we change the layout to text only. In the Fluent UI documentation, the sub-buttons don't typically have icons associated with them. You could keep this enabled if you'd like, and you can skip the next step that we're about to do. To offset the text of these sub-buttons so that they line up with the text of the other buttons, you'll need to set the left padding of the button to 32. Next, we'll go back to our sub-buttons container, and we'll set the height property to our sub-buttons gallery.allItemsCount multiplied by our sub-buttons gallery.template height. What this formula is doing is automatically calculating the height of the sub-buttons gallery based on how many items are in the gallery multiplied by the height of each item's container. This effectively calculates how tall the gallery needs to be to show all of its items. We'll also set the visible property to this item.itemOpen so that the sub-buttons only appear when the parent dropdown has been selected. We'll also go to our dropdown container. For the visible property of our dropdown container, we'll set it to be visible based on the item type being dropdown. Now we can see that when we expand our dropdown, we can see our sub-items. However, we also see those sub-items listed in our top-level navigation buttons. To fix this, we'll select our original navigation gallery, and we'll filter our collection of items to those with a blank item parent key field. Now we can only see the items that show in the nav bar are top-level items, and if we expand one of the submenus, we can see the sub-buttons are listed. If we flip back to the Fluent UI documentation, one behavior we can see is that when a sub-button is selected, there's an indicator showing that the button is indeed selected. When the dropdown is collapsed, an indicator appears on the dropdown button to show that one of the sub-buttons has been selected, and the dropdown's button text becomes a bolder weight. We'll add this indicator as well. In our dropdown container, we'll select the container used as an indicator for the selected button, and we'll go to the color property. We want to replace this with a formula that checks if any of the sub-buttons related to this dropdown are selected and that the dropdown is collapsed. If so, the indicator should be visible. We'll replace the first part of this if statement with a count rows function, counting the rows of our filtered collection where the item parent key equals this item.item key, as well as the item key equaling the currently selected button variable, and we'll check if this item.itemOpen equals false. If the count rows function is greater than 0, that means at least one of the sub-items has been selected, and we want to show our indicator. If not, we'll leave it transparent. We can copy the beginning part of this if statement and select our drop-down button's font weight property. We'll replace the part of this formula, checking if the selected button equals this item's item key, with our new formula, checking if any of the sub-buttons are selected and the drop-down is closed. We'll also copy this formula to the beginning of our icon style. Now at this point, let's go ahead and try out our component. We'll head over to our screens, and we'll go ahead and insert this into a sidebar container that I've set up. We can see the component on the screen pulling items from our collection that we created in the onStart of our app. We'll go ahead and enable flexible height so that it adjusts accordingly to the height of our container. We'll go ahead and insert this into our other screens as well. Now if we play our app, we can see we're on the home screen. And if I go ahead and click on the Projects option, we're now navigated to the Project screen. If we click on Available Training, now we navigate to the Available Training screen. As an item is selected, we see an indicator as well as the text of our button being bolder and our icon being filled. If I click on one of our dropdowns, we can see the different screens that are listed in this dropdown. We can click on Find Employee, and that navigates us to the Find Employee screen. Let's go ahead and try adding a new screen as well. We'll go ahead and duplicate our home screen, and we'll rename this to About. If we want this new screen to appear in our left-hand navigation, we'll go up to our app property and then go to onStart, and we'll go ahead and add a new button in this collection. In this case, I want it to be a top-level button, and I want to slot it in right below the home button, but above the divider. So I'll just go ahead and copy the home record and paste that directly below. We'll change the item key to About, the display name to About. We'll make the icon a globe, and we'll set the item screen to About as well. We'll leave the item type as button, and we don't want there to be a parent key for this item. If we right-click on App and we select Run on Start, now we can see our new About screen listed in our navigation. Let's say we want to add a new divider. We'll go back to our onStart property, and we can scroll down to where we have some of our different dividers. I'll just go ahead and copy divider 2, and let's say we want to put a divider between training and employee management. I'll go ahead and paste this divider between the two, and we'll rename the item key to divider 3. We'll run on start again, and now we can see a divider appears between available training and employee management. There may be cases where you need to programmatically set the selected navigation button rather than relying on the user to click the navigation button on the left-hand side. Some of those instances might be on the app start, you want a default selected item to be shown like the home button. Or maybe you have a form control And on success of a submitted form, you want to navigate to a different page. And in that case, you'd need to select a new button from our navigation pane. To show an example of this, I'll go ahead and add a new button to the screen. In the onSelect of this button, we'll set the var selected button to a lookup function, looking at our collection of navigation items, and we want to find the item where the item screen equals the screen that we're trying to set as the selected screen. So in this case, I'll set item screen equals projects. After this, the field that we want to return is the item key. After setting this variable, then we want to navigate to that screen. In the case of setting the default selected button when the app starts, you would want to leave out that navigation function. Now if we play our app, we can see we're on the home screen, but if I select this button, it's going to navigate us to the project screen. And we'll see that the projects button is now the selected item. Let's see how we can customize our component further. If you'd like to show or hide menu items based on different conditions, we can add an item visible property to each of the items in our navigation collection. We'll set a variable called var role, and we'll set the value of this to admin. In the real world, you might have a table in your data source looking up a person's role dynamically based on their email, but we'll do this for simplicity. In our very first button, let's set the item visible property as if var role equals admin, then this should be true. If not, false. This could also be written in shorthand as var role equals admin. We'll head to our components gallery and we'll add a filter condition for item visible equals true, or is blank item visible. We want to allow items with a blank item visible field, since those would be our dividers or our categories. You could add the item visible field to those as well if you want those to be dynamic. We'll also add this same formula to our sub-button gallery. Now if we run our onStart function again, we'll see that we can still see our button in our sidebar. Let's change our role to user now in our onStart function instead of admin. If we run the onStart function again, we can no longer see the home button. We are no longer an admin, so our home button disappears. And that's about it. If you have any questions about this component, please be sure to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. In the description of the video, I'll leave copies of the schema that you can use to create your different buttons, drop-downs, categories, and dividers. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.